Musicians suck at describing music.
It was all really warm, yet bright.
Spanky.
Earthy.
Didn't sound quite as toppy.
That's optimum brightness.
Mickey Mouse.
What? Didn't sound quite as toppy.
It didn't sound as toppy.
Dark but crisp.
Crunch.
Nasty. Well, it must have been as toppy.
We use imprecise metaphor to describe specific sounds.
It's an odd sound, isn't it? So fresh and sharp, like the taste of lemon juice.
I mean, what does it really mean when something sounds thin or round or smooth or thick? From the outset, they seem to be pretty bad descriptors because of how much subjectivity there is in them. Yet somehow, we as musicians all kind of know what they mean. It's like a secret code, a level that you only achieve after you've put in 10,000 hours of practice with the metronome or something. What other connections might this secret code afford us? If we have an intuitive connection between language and sound, might something similar exist with shapes and sound? What about art and music? Can we prove this? But that's going too far. I mean, it's not some secret intuitive code, right? Let's find out. Why is this note considered high and this note considered low? The words high and low tell us about pitch. Linguistically speaking, they contextualize that information into a vertical plane. You might think this is arbitrary. Why not think of pitch on a horizontal plane and associate frequency with left and right rather than up and down? And we do this to a certain extent. For example, when it comes to a piano, the lower keys are always on the left and the higher keys are always on the right. This makes sense due to the piano's physical form. But we still call the keys to the right of the piano the high keys and the keys to the left of the piano the low keys. Even in the context of an instrument that is physically designed with this implicit horizontal pitch framework, we still feel the need to overlay the concept of up and down onto it. And it doesn't escape me that there would undoubtedly be issues if you showed up at a gig and every member of the band had a different conception of pitch and you all use different language to describe the same thing. There would not just be communication breakdown, but communication chaos. Universal language and communication in music is absolutely essential, well, to making music.
With an alert crew, even our primitive vocal communications are unnecessary.
I'm not advocating that we redefine or reconceptualize pitch. I'm just pointing out how arbitrary it seems. It might seem arbitrary, and you can think of pitch horizontally rather than vertically. There's nothing at face wrong with that. But behavior, culture, and linguistics seldom develops arbitrarily. In his paper, Music-Aided Design, The Foundations of Spatial Music, Felix Faire argues that the vertical pitch metaphor that's ubiquitous in our culture today can be traced to the biomechanical operation required for us to produce sounds at different pitches. He writes, "Our vocal production of sound affects our spatial perception of pitch through the perceived location of vocal noises relative to the ears. The position of the larynx in the throat moves vertically to allow a higher or lower vocal range. This physical change in position affects the perceived location of the produced sound." The idea is that when we try and sing higher notes, our larynx physically moves up to accommodate that register. And it's this biomechanical motion of the larynx which has informed our intuitive understanding of pitch. You can observe this within yourself, by the way. If you grab your neck about right here and you sing a really low note and glissando up to a really high note, ooh, excuse me, you can physically feel your larynx move up and down your throat. Kind of cool, kind of weird. This example could potentially help show that our understanding of pitch is deeply tied to the physical mechanism and process which creates it. There's also some fairly convincing arguments that suggest we understand pitch in the way we do linguistically because in nature, sounds that come from up above us, namely birds or the rustling of trees, tend to capture a higher part of the frequency spectrum, as opposed to sounds you might hear on the ground, like the low growl of a giant-ass bear.
Oh, look, an eagle!
Whatever the reason for the connection, it goes deep. Legitimately, like as I'm recording this, I am struggling to describe pitch in any other way that doesn't reference high or low, and it's really difficult. Now, we've linked the building blocks of music to language, at least in part. But can we link language to shape? Well, only one way to find out, so let's look at some shapes. Specifically, these shapes. If I were to ask you, with no context, which of these shapes is called Kiki and which is called Bouba, what would you say? If you thought this was Kiki and this was Bouba, you'd be correct. Or rather, you'd be in the majority. When presented with similar shapes in a study conducted by Wolfgang Köhler, 95% of the participants identified this shape as Kiki and this shape as Bouba. To me, it makes perfect sense. The jagged, pointed angles of Kiki kind of just feel like they should be called Kiki, and the rounded contours of Bouba feel like Bouba. This is what linguists would call cross-modal correspondence, which is a phenomenon where we link two seemingly independent sensory features to each other. Correlating the sounds we hear and make with shapes, textures, and taste is all fairly normal. So I wonder if this visual linguistic phenomenon extends into the realm of music perception and interpretation. In other words, I think we can connect shapes to music and show that there are intuitive, naturally occurring relationships that go unspoken between musician and the shapes they interact with. Time to run an experiment. In order to pull this off, we're gonna need a very special piece of music notation, a graphic score. Graphic scores are a type of non-traditional musical notation that really started showing up with 20th century composers like Stockhausen and Cage. These scores, which are seemingly half art unto themselves, often use images, symbols, graphic elements, illustrations, and text to convey meaning or performance instructions for a musician to interpret. Some use familiar symbols and notation, some don't. Sometimes the scores are meant to be read somewhat traditionally from left to right, some not so much. The variability and lack of standardization implicit in graphic notation can often get an eye roll or two from the more practical musicians out there. But ambiguity of a graphic score leaves most of the performance up to interpretation, which actually helps us in conducting this experiment. The score that I've very much struggled to draft up here contains two panels which are read left to right. A playhead will move across the score like this, so we can follow along with where the performer is in the piece. The top panel contains elements akin to Bouba, while the bottom panel consists of elements of Kiki. I've rounded up 3 of my fellow YouTubers and TikTokers who have all agreed to interpret this score for me. But there's a twist. None of them know that I've set this experiment up. All they know is that I've asked them to interpret the score in any way they see fit, within the bounds of the rules that I just laid out. If I'm right, we should hear clear differences between the two panels, with rounder sounds and potentially softer attacks or smoother qualities here, and more precise attacks or percussive sounds here. Hi, Levi from the future here. We just got all the graphic score interpretations back. We're gonna listen through and analyze them all together, and see if we can observe this idea of universal interpretation of shapes through music. Okay, so I listened to your interpretation. It was absolutely mind-blowing. It was beautiful. How do you go about interpreting something like that?
At first, what I did is I tried to see what was what was like a common thing through the whole image.
I loved the attention to detail. The nuance he brought to the table was absolutely unreal.
So I started with the middle line, which goes through like the first picture and the second one. So I started from that, and I decided that that was like a sustained note, like something that would be continuous throughout the piece. And that note goes into like this circle thing. So I was thinking that when the note was circled, it was like an emphasis on that specific note. That continuous note, I decided for some reason it was the major seventh of like the main chord. And I tried to follow the patterns in the lines where it gets like darker patches and lighter.
Every mark on the score was accounted for and represented by some sound or effect. Even this somewhat insignificant dot right here is represented by a tiny percussive hit.
I started following the oscillating line with the bass gain, so bringing it in and out, which led to the circled so that it would join the sustained note, the bass note. Since the note is circled, I was thinking that it had to be like echo or delayed. So it's like everything that's like a meeting point for that piece. After that, there's like all these smaller circles, which I saw as like bells or notes. So I did each one following the height, like in the chord height of the notes. And then goes into like some noise and it cuts direct.
Both of these features are interpreted as some kind of swell, but each undeniably has their own character, which is clearly influenced by the differences in their shapes.
After doing that, I went on to the next one, which felt like it could be either a continuity of the first thing, or it could be something in parallel. So I tried to view it as both at the same time. So that one was more like grainy and blotchy. So I did similar textures, but I put the sketch cassette plugin with the dropout at the maximum so that it's like all cut up and the audio is literally dropping out. I saw the lines that come after that thing as like some new continuous notes coming in, like a chord. I place notes with those kind of similar intervals for that thing that come in gradually as it goes up. And after doing all that, I was thinking of the details. So the first one has like the small circles at the beginning and lines. So I started adding percussions with the Morph Beats Micro Morphin, which is
the contraption.
This instrument. I tried adding details, so like the circles, just playing around while looking at the image. And that also became the triangles at the first of the second one and throughout the second part of the second graphic.
The most notable thing, I think, is the clear timbral shift between the top panel and the bottom panel. The Micro Marvin is played mallet side in the top panel, which contours some of the attack and higher end frequencies. But in the bottom panel, the mallet is flipped and the Micro Marvin is played with the stick end, which in turn yields a more percussive sound and a more immediate attack. On the second row, you flipped and we're hitting the Micro Marvin with the tail end of the stick.
Yeah,
What do you think about that?
I didn't think about it while doing it. It just happened. I guess I went into bigger movements that I saw in the images and then gradually going into details. Anytime I compose something, there's always images in my head, and usually the images will come before if I'm composing. If I'm improvising, it's a bit different because it will be at the same time, but there's always, to me, a visual aspect and a storyline.
Whoa. Well, that atmosphere is so ethereal. Seems like the vocals are on a pitch axis, following the shape of the semicircles and triangles. I wonder if the rounded shapes correspond to the portamento between the notes. There's a really smooth pitch slide from note to note in the voice, but I don't hear that in the second panel. Here we don't see as much smooth gliding between notes, but rather more abrupt changes.
I've always been one to enjoy kind of taking more shapes than rather like, not necessarily just composing notes, but rather thinking of what lines will sound nice and then picking out the notes that'll work well later, and so that's kind of, similar to how I went about this whole process. Essentially what I remember, this actually brought me back immediately to my college days. We did something like this, a little master class where someone came in and basically said, one by one, we're going to go up on the board, just write a random symbol, shape, whatever. And then we're going to go across it. And, when your part comes, interpret it as if you, as notes, And
Yeah.
so I remember back then, actually, I decided like, I'm just going to draw the tiniest little up at the very top, and no one was like, "The hell are you gonna do with that?" And so every time it came across, I just like a little tiny squeak or something, and I was like, "Oh, it just brought me back to that." I loved it. And so, in terms of the shape itself, for me, the biggest thing was I noticed the overall like forefront of the line. I began with the instrumental itself. I kind of was like, I'm going to emphasize the line itself. I was like, that can be a vocal thing. But when it came to the shapes themselves, I was like, that I would like to be more atmospheric and kind of find out ways to interpret where lines are, vocal things, shapes are instruments or sounds. And so that's kind of how I ended up just doing a little bit of a drone in the beginning. But then, once that circle hits, I was like, that's where the sound hits. I pictured that as the punch, so to speak. It visually
Sure.
kind of alludes to that. So, come in with all those, that I had that one big synth that just sounds like a,
Yeah.
And then as I see all these little dots kind of coming together to the one point, that's when I'm like, all right, bring in the chimes. And then moving forward into the second line, I wanted to incorporate vocals and the synth for the next melody. And I did that because the vocals, whistle tones, naturally, I like to get more of a slide into them. And then obviously because of the difference in shape themselves from the lines, having the curvy line up top, I was like, perfect, slides, it'll be perfect, it'll be the best representation. But the bottom, I was like, all right, we've got some straight jagged points. I need more emphasis on the points themselves. The most exciting part personally for me was this little end with the triangles here on this pseudo staff, I guess. If you have headphones on, you may have heard that I did a bit of stereo work. I notated it so that black triangles was one sound, hollow triangles was another sound, and going up or down just depended on which direction they were panning. So I created this sound. It's actually something I've been using for years. It's just reverb the crap out of an arpeggiating harp until it just sounds like this. And then using the triangles, I was like, let's visually represent that by having them open and close in the EQ. So you can literally see the shape of the triangle, hear the shape of it. That one little line just before all of those lines open up, I kind of just pictured that as a point that would be able to shift. Kind of everything came to a closure. There's a small little line that's like a reset for something new. So that's kind of where I took that direction with the slight change in key at the very end, as well as just using all of those extra gritty triangles in there to throw some gnarly gain and just distortion, just everything to make it sound like it's just, breaking down at the very end. I definitely find that a lot of the details that came out in terms of the chimey sounds continuing to the end, kind of representing the splatters on the bottom half versus having just more of an ominous drone on the top with the hazy, scratch marks. That was incidental, kind of like how I said, I was really focused on the line more so than I was the overall background and the details. And so it was kind of interesting to me how bringing those chimes in and keeping those sparkly noises all throughout the second half made sense with all those splatters kind of at the bottom. So kind of cool how, I had one idea, but incidentally, I think it made more sense in the end just by trusting it.
Hell yeah, okay. We have groove. I love that Julian took a different approach here. It's way more lyrical than it is sound design. The whistle sings this beautiful, sweet legato line where it sort of ebbs and flows, not really having any hard stops or abruptness to it. And then we swell into panel 2, where you get the polar opposite. The juxtaposition between the two is really neat and showcases in a really maximal way the difference between smooth music that doesn't really have any edges and its percussive, edgeful musical counterpart. It seems like the percussive accents are coordinated with the abrupt changes in line direction here. This is in stark contrast with the top panel, which has no abrupt changes. In terms of wave and attack analysis with the track, you can literally point out, without even hearing it, which panel is which. I think it's fascinating that in running this experiment, unprompted, the physical wave shapes match the contours of our graphic score itself. One commonality here that I didn't expect, but in hindsight I probably should have, is that everyone interpreted the ends of the panels as swells, which to me totally makes sense. I'd probably do the same. We all work with DAWs and we all use swells, which is one of the most recognizable waveform shapes, so I really shouldn't be that surprised. Julian's swells are awesome here. He sort of interprets the myriad of dots in this wonderful pointillist style.
So the way that I interpreted it is, it's like a story about like a wizard or something like that, and it's almost like a Lord of the Rings kind of thing. But roughly saying, so they start off in this like hilly, peaceful place, then this circle with the music note, it almost has like that lantern looking thing. And so then the thing to the right of it is like the wizard being dematerialized and like teleported to then the next part, which is like this sort of hellish mountainous region. And like, he's like, whoa, what's going on here? He starts like walking around and everything. And then these like triangles, he like walks upon this like layer of like, I don't know, triangle wizards or something. I don't know. But like, you know, these like evil characters, and it's like sort of revealed what's going to happen. And then at the end, the leader of them like casts this spell and is like creating an army or something. So it was a very like visual sort of like story representation. But it does have those two parts because, you know, because it's very clear, like the first half is different from the second half.
I should probably start by admitting something, that I sort of tricked you and everyone else involved in this process.
Ooh.
Oh, what?
So essentially what I'm trying to do is see if there's an intuitive, predictive link between visuals and sound. Have you ever heard of the Kiki Bouba experiment?
Mm-mm.
I have not.
It's really simple. Basically, you give this to your participants and you say, which one is called Kiki and which one is called Bouba? So if I were to ask you, the leftmost shape, is that Kiki or is it Bouba? What would you intuitively say?
I would say it's Bouba.
I assume, and I would also say most people said Bouba.
Well, naturally, I would say that the rounded one is Bouba and the spiky Kiki.
Exactly. Yeah, everyone does. It's like something like 90-something% of all people across all cultures say the exact same thing. There's a lot of theories as to why. A lot of people think it's because the actual sound you need to produce like Kiki is an unvoiced plosive. It's a pretty sharp sound in the front of your mouth, where Bouba is more of like a rounded back vowel. And so there's these like psychological linguistic links that people point to as to why, you know, everyone seems to have this link. And I got thinking like, hey, I wonder if this works with music. Yeah, so the graphic score I shared with you, the top row has elements based in Bouba, so everything is rounded. And then the bottom row is sharp, so everything's very pointed. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna present this and then see if we can find links between each person who interprets it. And I just wanted to see kind of like what would happen.
No, definitely. I mean, that makes me think of the part that I have with the triangles at the end with the panning and the black and white. Because visually in my score itself, actually, if I can possibly share my screen with it, I might be able to pull it up here real quick and just kind of show you the logic breakdown if you want. So this is that part that I was saying with the harps and the panning. You can see here that they are panned over as far as they can go. But this is, you can literally see visually how I made triangles to go with it when the envelopes are opening. So this is the high cut frequency. So yeah, they're opening up very harshly and sharply, as you can see. But I think it's kind of funny that like, if those shapes were circles, I probably would have done something more like this on all of them, you know, but because they were those harsh things, I wanted that point to them. But if those things were circles, if they were like half spheres or something, I definitely probably would have done something like this and rounded out the attack.
Well, just in the like synth world, the sine wave versus triangle wave is exactly like a rounder sound versus a sharper sound.
I interpreted this as like a story. Like I tried to see like how I could write a story around this. And so I think it actually does fall into what you're saying, because it's sort of, there are like two parts of the story, you know, and for that exact reason, because the two halves of the score are very different in nature.
So is there an intuitive connection between music and shape that exists in the same way that there's a connection between shapes and language, or language and music? Can we observe in a measurable way the cross-modal correspondence between shapes and sound? Well, admittedly, it's a pretty poorly designed experiment and really can't be considered anything more than anecdotal due to issues with control, sample size, bias, etc. I'm only one man, guys. And it's also important to know that when I analyze these interpretations, I'm doing so through a very colored lens and probably see more of what I want to see than I care to admit. But if nothing else, I think this experiment provides some really interesting insight into our brain's capacity for patterns, cognition, and interpretation. There seems to be points of consistency present in everyone's interpretation. The music everyone came up with may have been wildly different in terms of instrumentation, genre, and style, but key moments and shape attributes across the score seem to be understood and treated by everyone with that same elusive, imprecise, unspoken musician's code. Maybe it's not as imprecise as I thought it was. Huge thanks to MAYSUN, Krispy, and Julian Schoming for agreeing to participate in this experiment. Links to all of their music and socials will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching the video. My name is Levi McClain. Let's start a discussion down in the comment section because this is a super interesting space to be in. You got graphic scores, you got music cognition, you got interpretation, sound, and shape. What do you guys think the relationship is there? I'm gonna make it a point to respond to every comment down below. So if you have any questions or you just wanna add to the discussion, please do so. And if you're new here and you're getting some value from my content, be sure to subscribe and ring that bell. I think I broke the bell. Oh, yeah. See you in the next one, guys.